How to create a proficiency scale at CCSD. Today I'm going to think through how to create a proficiency scale. When making a proficiency scale, I'm going to start with the meeting standard level. Since this is the expected level for all students and will drive the learning, I'm going to go to my grade level standards and copy the power standard word for word and place it on my proficiency scale under the meeting standard level. Once my grade level power standard is in the meeting standard level, I'm going to read through my standard and identify what I want my students to be able to know and do. I was able to identify and chunk 4 components within this power standard. I see that my students will need to develop a model, know how water cycles, and the role that the sun's energy and force of gravity play within the cycling. I am now going to unpack the 4 chunks I have identified within my power standard into skills that will be focused and taught to help students meet the comprehensive standard. My first component I chunked was develop a model, so I unpacked that into what my students will be expected to do, which is create a conceptual or physical model. The second component I identified was the cycling of water through Earth's systems. After looking at it and unpacking this component, I know my students will need to be able to describe various pathways of the water cycle. I will continue to use the same process for the last 2 components, where I identified that students will need to be able to explain the transfer of energy and be able to describe how gravity interacts with water in different phases. After completing the meeting level of the proficiency scale, I'm going to move to the approaching standard level. I know by looking at the proficiency scale template that the approaching standard is where I identified the fundamental skills that are needed for students to be successful at the meeting standard level. I'm going to think about and discuss with my team members the basic vocabulary and processes we believe are needed for students to perform at the meeting standard level, along with recall and comprehension. So first I'm going to go back to the power standard, and I'm going to look through and see what key vocabulary that must be taught and understood in order for the students to be able to perform at the power standard. As I read through my standard, I can identify Earth system, energy, force, and gravity to be vocabulary terms I need them to understand and be able to use in order to be at a meeting level. I then need to stop and think, is there any vocabulary that is not listed directly in the standard, but students will need in order to be successful at the meeting level? I will look through Atlas at my units and or lower grade level units and at my supporting standards to identify other vocabulary that will need to be addressed. After looking through Atlas, I see that my supporting standard is very much aligned to my power standard, and both standards use the term energy. So I know we have covered this term, but again, students will have to know and be able to use it to be meeting the power standard. Lastly, I can see in my previously taught units that students learned about water molecules and the different paths water molecules take. So to me, molecule is a word students will continue to need to know and be able to use. So to recap, I started by identifying vocabulary within the power standard and then looked for vocabulary from my supporting standards and from previously taught units, my grade level and or grade levels prior to mine. The second part of the approaching level is the process that students must be able to recall and comprehend before being able to apply at the meeting level. I begin by looking at what students will do from my meeting level on the proficiency scale. From there, I unpack what the students needed to be able to do at meeting into skills that are scaffolded. So I will look at my first bullet from the meeting level that is content related, which is describe the various pathways of the water cycle. I know that in order to be able to describe various pathways, students will first need to be able to identify and describe the different phases. So my approaching level for that bullet would be to identify and describe each phase individually. I continue through with the same process for each one of my students' will do's. You are not limited to just the descriptors in the meeting level. You might need more in the approaching level to prepare your students for meeting, where as you can see, I did not unpack, create a conceptual or physical model because it was not content driven and no scaffolding would be needed. So to recap the approaching level, I first identified the vocabulary that would be necessary for students to perform at the meeting standard level. I then looked at what I expected students to be able to do at the meeting level and created scaffolds to the power standard for the approaching level. Lastly, we have the exemplary level. This level is not just harder tasks, but learning that requires deeper or more vigorous thinking. I'm going to start by analyzing my standard and identifying what depth of knowledge level it is at. You can use the depth of knowledge levels or Bloom's taxonomy. After looking at my standard, I can see that it was written at a level 3 thinking, since developing a model for a complex situation is a level 3 activity, and it will be used to develop the level 3 thinking of developing a logical argument. I want to move my students from a strategic thinking to extended thinking, which would be a depth of knowledge level 4. When looking through the level 4 activities, I've decided that to deepen their understanding, I would like them to analyze and synthesize information from multiple sources. This is how I created my exemplary level, where students will analyze and synthesize previous errors or misconceptions about the cycling of water through the Earth's systems. Just like I did in the meeting and approaching levels, I'm going to unpack and list specifically what students will need to do to show their understanding. Students will have to analyze multiple sources, their own and others, and also be able to synthesize that information to construct explanations about the cycling of water through the Earth's systems. I just have to remember that sometimes my power standard will start at a depth of knowledge level 2. So in that case, I would push my students in the exemplary level to a depth of knowledge level 3 thinking. And if my power standard is already at a depth of knowledge level 4, then I create a learning opportunity that is still at a level 4, but a different way of using the content that will push their thinking. So to recap today's learning, start with the meeting level and place your power standard on the proficiency scale and unpack the standard into what the students will know and be asked to do in order to meet the power standard. Second, move to the approaching level. Look through your power standard, supporting standards, and previous units to identify key vocabulary terms. Then use what students will do in the meeting level and unpack those into scaffolded skills. Lastly, using the depth of knowledge levels or Bloom's taxonomy, identify what level your power standard is written at and then create what students will do at a higher level.